What if the greatest shifts in power never happened on a battlefield at all? What if history's most pivotal moments were decided not by armies clashing, but by scribes bending over parchment in candlelit rooms, by words chosen so carefully they could topple kings, redirect empires, and rewrite the future without a drop of blood being spilled? We often picture the medieval world as a place defined by force, knights in shining armor, castle sieges, and epic clashes for land and honor. But behind the scenes, something far more subtle and often more powerful was at work. Hidden from view, secret scripts, treaties, and delicate decrees were being drafted, sealed, and exchanged, carrying more influence than any army ever could. These documents didn't just record history, they created it. A single forged letter could legitimize a pope's claim to vast territories. A carefully worded treaty could prevent a civil war or reshape the borders of nations for centuries to come. From the shadowy chambers of Byzantine emperors to the scriptoriums of Frankish scribes serving Charlemagne, the written word became a silent weapon, a tool of diplomacy, deception, and breathtaking foresight. It was in these texts that true power often resided, not in the strength of a sword arm, but in the elegance of a clause, the implication of a promise, or the authority of a seal. Today, we're going to uncover 20 of these extraordinary documents, secret scripts that changed the course of rulership across the medieval world, all without a single battle being fought. We'll explore how words on a page outmaneuvered the mightiest warriors, how ink and parchment redirected the flow of history itself, and how these hidden instruments of influence still echo in the ways we think about power, negotiation, and peace today. This is a journey into the quiet heart of governance where the stroke of a pen truly proved mightier than the sword. We often picture the medieval world as a grand stage for armored knights and epic sieges, but behind the scenes, the real architects of power were rarely on the battlefield. They were the scribes, the diplomats, and the clerks laboring in quiet chambers, their most potent weapon a well-sharpened quill. In an age where communication was slow and authority was constantly contested, the written word became the ultimate tool for governance. Rulers quickly learned that a carefully crafted document could achieve what an army might not: lasting legitimacy, secured allegiances, and the avoidance of ruinously expensive wars. This was a form of power that was both subtle and profound, operating through charters, treaties, personal letters, and royal decrees. Each document was a precision instrument, designed to convey authority, forge bonds, or quietly undermine rivals. The creation of these texts was a matter of utmost seriousness. Every word was weighed for its political impact, every phrase constructed to leave no room for unintended interpretation. In many cases, the documents themselves were considered so sensitive that they were encoded or their existence kept entirely secret. The Holy Roman Emperors, for example, were known to use complex ciphers in their diplomatic correspondence, ensuring that if a messenger was intercepted, their plans for alliance or negotiation would remain confidential. This practice of clandestine communication allowed rulers to build networks of power and execute delicate strategies far from the prying eyes of their adversaries. It transformed the scriptorium and the chancery into something akin to a modern-day situation room, where information was the primary currency of influence. These scripts functioned as the essential machinery of statecraft. A royal charter could legitimize a dubious claim to a territory, preventing a border conflict before it even began. A treaty could bind two powerful families together, merging their interests and resources through marriage and mutual obligation, thereby consolidating power across regions. Even a personal letter, if written with sufficient cunning, could sow discord among an enemy's ranks or reassure a wavering ally of continued support. This reliance on documentation created a framework for stability, allowing rulers to administer vast and diverse realms without being physically present everywhere at once. The law, written down and distributed, became the extended arm of the monarch's will, a constant presence in the lives of their subjects. Understanding this context is absolutely vital. It shifts our focus from the dramatic clash of swords to the calculated stroke of a pen, revealing a more nuanced and perhaps more intelligent medieval world. By appreciating how these documents worked as tools for expansion, consolidation, and peacekeeping, we can truly grasp their transformative potential. They were not merely records of events, they were events in themselves, capable of redirecting the course of history without a single casualty. This foundation in the quiet power of the written word sets the stage for us to explore the specific scripts that did exactly that. And so we arrive at our first and perhaps most audacious example of a script that reshaped the world, the donation of Constantine. Picture the scene in 8th century Europe. The papacy, based in Rome, found itself in a precarious position, caught between the sway of the Byzantine Empire to the east and the rising power of the Frankish kings to the north. It was in this climate of political uncertainty that a remarkable document surfaced, one that would grant the Bishop of Rome an unprecedented level of earthly authority. This text claimed to be a solemn decree from none other than Emperor Constantine the Great, written centuries earlier as he departed for his new capital in Constantinople. In it, the first Christian emperor supposedly made a grand and grateful bequest to Pope Sylvester I, out of gratitude for being miraculously cured of leprosy and converted to Christianity. Constantine's decree granted the Pope and his successors permanent temporal dominion over the city of Rome, all of Italy, and the entire Western Roman Empire. The implications of this single document were nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, the papacy possessed a written, imperial justification for its own political sovereignty. It wasn't just about spiritual leadership anymore. This document positioned the Pope as a direct successor to the Roman emperors in the West, a literal king of kings. When a powerful secular ruler like Charlemagne sought to unite Western Europe under his banner, popes could point to the donation to assert that any imperial crown was in fact a gift granted by the Church, and that all temporal power ultimately flowed from St. Peter's successor. This gave the medieval papacy immense leverage in its dealings with emperors and kings for hundreds of years. It was the ultimate trump card in any political dispute, a supposedly ancient and unimpeachable authority that could be used to claim territories, demand fealty, and settle thorny questions of who held ultimate power. The genius of the forgery lay in its timing and its audacity. Created in an era where few could question the authenticity of an ancient Roman document, it filled a crucial need for the papacy, providing a legal and historical foundation for its growing political ambitions. Its influence was pervasive and long-lasting, cited repeatedly by popes throughout the Middle Ages to justify their interventions in secular affairs. It was a cornerstone of papal policy, a key piece of evidence in the Investiture Controversy, and a central pillar in the Church's argument for the supremacy of spiritual power over temporal might. The document's eventual unmasking in the 15th century by scholars like Lorenzo Valla, who used linguistic and historical analysis to prove it was a medieval creation, is a fascinating story in itself. Yet, even after its exposure as a clever fabrication, the donation's impact could not be undone. For over 7 centuries, it had successfully done its job, fundamentally altering the relationship between church and state, and proving that a powerfully written fiction could sometimes become a more potent force for change than any army. But the immense empire Charlemagne built was always destined to fracture under the weight of its own size and the ambitions of his heirs. Upon his death, the crown passed to his son, Louis the Pious, who struggled for decades to maintain the unity his father had forged by conquest. When Louis died in 840, that fragile unity shattered completely. His three surviving sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, were locked in a bitter struggle for supremacy, a conflict that threatened to plunge all of Western Europe into a protracted and bloody civil war. Armies were raised, battles were fought, but no single brother could achieve a decisive victory. It was in this stalemate, this moment of exhausted mutual destruction, that they turned not to the sword but to the scribe. In 843, they gathered at Verdun not for a final battle, but for a meticulous negotiation. The document they produced, the Treaty of Verdun, stands as a masterclass in using a written accord to manage a crisis that force could not resolve. The genius of the treaty lay in its breathtakingly detailed and pragmatic division. This was no simple, hand-wavy agreement. It was a comprehensive land survey and political blueprint committed to parchment. Lothair, as the eldest, retained the imperial title and received the so-called Middle Kingdom, a long, sprawling strip of territory running from the North Sea all the way down through Italy. To the east of this, the lands primarily populated by Germanic-speaking peoples were granted to Louis the German. To the west, the Romance-speaking territories were given to Charles the Bald. The negotiators didn't just draw lines on a map. They carefully considered natural borders like rivers, the economic viability of each kingdom, ensuring each had access to coastlines and resources, and the existing loyalties of local nobility. This precision was its greatest strength. By leaving so little to ambiguity, the treaty removed countless future points of contention. It provided a clear, mutually recognized framework that, while it didn't erase all future rivalries, fundamentally prevented an all-out war of succession between the brothers. It was a divorce settlement for an empire, and its careful terms ensured the separation was as peaceful as possible. The long-term consequences of this single document are almost impossible to overstate. While Lothair's Middle Kingdom would eventually fragment into the myriad states of Italy, Burgundy, and Lorraine, a fragmentation that would make this region a bloody battlefield for centuries, the kingdoms granted to Louis and Charles proved far more durable. The eastern lands of Louis the German became the nucleus of what would eventually be the Holy Roman Empire, a predominantly German-speaking entity. The western lands of Charles the Bald became the heart of the Kingdom of France. In this way, the Treaty of Verdun didn't just end a family quarrel. It literally drew the first major political borders between what we now recognize as France and Germany. It planted the seeds of distinct national identities that would define European history for over 1,000 years, all the way through the world wars of the 20th century. Furthermore, by formalizing the division of power, the treaty accelerated the development of the feudal system. Local lords now owed allegiance to one of three distinct kings, strengthening regional power centers and setting the stage for the decentralized political landscape that would characterize the High Middle Ages. The Treaty of Verdun stands as a monumental testament to the power of a negotiated text. It proves that a well-drafted document can be more powerful than a victorious army, for while a battle can decide a single day, a treaty can shape the fate of a continent for a millennium. Yet the story of King John and the Magna Carta is a powerful reminder that even the most reluctant of rulers can be brought to the negotiating table. John's reign was a masterclass in misrule, a period defined by disastrous military campaigns, exorbitant taxes, and a capricious approach to justice that alienated nearly every level of English society. His loss of Normandy to the French King Philip II was a national humiliation, and his subsequent efforts to fund a war to reclaim it pushed the country's finances and the patience of his barons to the breaking point. He levied scutage, a tax on knights, at an unprecedented rate, seized baronial lands on flimsy pretexts, and manipulated the royal courts to punish his enemies and reward his favorites. By the spring of 1215, the realm was on the brink of civil war. A coalition of powerful barons, backed by the church and the merchants of London, had had enough. They organized militarily, captured the capital, and presented the king with a list of non-negotiable demands. Cornered and with few options, John met them at Runnymede, a water meadow beside the Thames, on June 15, 1215. There, he attached his great seal to a document that would become known as the Great Charter, the Magna Carta. It is crucial to understand that the barons at Runnymede were not revolutionaries dreaming of democracy. They were pragmatic feudal lords seeking to protect their own privileges and properties from a tyrannical king. The original charter was therefore a very medieval document, filled with specific grievances about feudal dues, inheritance laws, and the abuse of royal authority over their lands. It demanded the removal of corrupt officials, the reversal of specific unfair seizures of land, and the guarantee that a widow could not be forced into remarriage. But woven into this fabric of self-interest were threads of a much broader and more revolutionary principle. The most famous clause, number 39, stated that no free man could be imprisoned, stripped of his property, or outlawed, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. This was a direct assault on the king's ability to act arbitrarily. It established the cornerstone of due process, the idea that the law itself, not the momentary whim of a ruler, was the supreme authority. Another clause promised that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed. In essence, the Magna Carta created a written framework that made the king accountable, not to God alone, but to the law and the community of the realm. The immediate peace it brokered was fragile. King John almost immediately wrote to the Pope, who obligingly declared the charter null and void, plunging England into the brief but bitter First Barons' War. John's death the next year, however, allowed his supporters to reissue the charter on behalf of his young son, Henry III, as a way to secure peace and gain baronial support. This was the genius of the document's survival. Over the following centuries, whenever English monarchs overstepped their bounds, Parliament and reformers would dust off the Magna Carta and invoke its principles. It was reinterpreted and reaffirmed over 40 times, its meaning gradually expanding from a shield for baronial privileges to a foundation for the rights of all English subjects. It became the ultimate precedent, proving that governance could be a negotiated contract. This idea would cross the Atlantic centuries later, deeply influencing the framers of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Magna Carta's true power, therefore, was not in its immediate success, but in its enduring potency as a symbol. It demonstrated, for the first time in such a clear and lasting way, that a written text could force a ruler to submit to the law, setting a precedent for peaceful reform that would echo through the halls of power for centuries to come. While the Magna Carta established limits on a single king's power, the sprawling, complex Holy Roman Empire faced a far more intricate challenge: how to choose its ruler in the first place. This was not a hereditary monarchy in the simple sense. For centuries, the title of King of the Romans, which led to the imperial crown, was theoretically elective. But in practice, this process was a recipe for chaos. The absence of a clear, agreed-upon procedure meant that every succession was a potential crisis. Powerful dukes, archbishops, and princes would form factions, back rival candidates, and often plunge the entire German realm into civil war to settle the question of who should lead. It was a system where might made right, and the authority of the emperor was constantly undermined from the moment of his election, as he owed his position to backroom deals and promises that weakened his standing. This cycle of violence and uncertainty threatened to tear the empire apart from within, making it vulnerable to external threats and incapable of presenting a united front. Enter Charles IV, one of the most astute and politically savvy emperors of the medieval period. He recognized that this ad hoc, chaotic system was the empire's greatest weakness. Instead of trying to impose his will by force, he turned to the power of law and documentation. In 1356, after extensive consultation and negotiation, he issued a decree of monumental importance, the Golden Bull. The name itself, derived from the golden seal bulla that authenticated it, signified its unparalleled authority. This was not a mere suggestion or a temporary fix. It was a fundamental constitutional law designed to bring order from chaos. Charles understood that to strengthen the empire, he first had to regulate the very process that created its leader. The bull's genius was in its breathtaking detail and clarity, leaving almost no room for the ambiguous interpretations that had fueled past conflicts. At the heart of the Golden Bull was its meticulous definition of the electoral college. It permanently fixed the number of electors at 7, granting this immense privilege to 3 spiritual princes, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, and 4 secular lords, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. This was a masterstroke. By naming them specifically, the bull ended generations of squabbling over who had a right to vote, instantly elevating these 7 princes above their peers and giving them a vested interest in maintaining the system. Their roles and privileges were laid out with exacting precision. They were granted virtual sovereignty within their own territories. Their lands were declared indivisible to prevent their power from being diluted through inheritance, and they received exclusive rights to mine precious metals and mint coins. In one move, Charles secured the loyalty of the empire's most powerful men by making them partners in a stable political order rather than potential rivals in a bloody free-for-all. The bull then laid out, step by step, the exact procedure for an election, reading almost like a modern-day instruction manual to prevent any disputes. Upon the death of an emperor, the Archbishop of Mainz was required to summon the electors to the city of Frankfurt within 30 days. They were to meet in a sealed room, with no outside influence permitted, and were sworn to make a choice without any discussion of prior agreements or promises. Voting was to be conducted by a simple majority, a crucial point that prevented a single stubborn elector from deadlocking the entire process. The candidate who received the most votes was immediately proclaimed king. This clear, transparent process removed the fog of war and backroom politics that had previously decided imperial successions. It transformed a period of extreme danger and uncertainty into a predictable, almost bureaucratic event. The authority of the new emperor was now derived from a lawful, recognized process, giving him a legitimacy that his predecessors, chosen by conflict, could only dream of. The impact of the Golden Bull cannot be overstated. It successfully eliminated the scourge of succession wars within the Holy Roman Empire for centuries to come. While political maneuvering and diplomacy certainly continued, they were now channeled through a legal framework rather than settled on the battlefield. This stability allowed the empire to function, despite its famously decentralized nature, for another 450 years until its dissolution in 1806. The document itself became the closest thing the empire had to a written constitution, a testament to the power of a regulatory script to impose coherence on a fragmented political landscape. Charles IV, by choosing the pen over the sword, achieved what armies could not. He forged a lasting peace from the inside out, proving that the most effective way to wield power is sometimes to codify it. While the Golden Bull brought order to imperial elections, it was built upon a foundational peace that had been hard 1 decade earlier, a peace that ended one of the most explosive conflicts between church and state in all of medieval history. This was the Investiture Controversy, a struggle that had simmered for over 50 years, pitting popes against emperors in a high-stakes battle over a seemingly simple question: who had the right to appoint a bishop? To the modern ear, this might sound like a dry administrative dispute, but in the 11th and 12th centuries, it was a question that cut to the very heart of power. Bishops were not just spiritual leaders, they were major feudal lords controlling vast tracts of land, commanding knights, and collecting taxes. They were integral parts of the political and military machinery of the realm. For an emperor, controlling these appointments was essential to maintaining his authority and ensuring the loyalty of his most powerful vassals. For the Church, however, this practice, known as lay investiture, was a grave sin, a corruption of spiritual office by worldly powers. It was a clash of two competing visions of world order, and it escalated to the point of excommunications, rival antipopes, and the very real threat of widespread war across Christendom. The crisis reached its peak under the determined and pugnacious Emperor Henry IV and the equally formidable Pope Gregory VII. Gregory's radical Gregorian reforms sought to purify the Church by stripping secular rulers of any role in ecclesiastical appointments. Henry, seeing this as a direct assault on his imperial authority, refused to comply. The conflict became intensely personal. Gregory excommunicated Henry, absolving all of the emperor's subjects from their oaths of allegiance, a move that effectively encouraged open rebellion. In a famous act of political theater, Henry was forced to cross the Alps in the dead of winter in 1077 to seek the Pope's forgiveness at Canossa, standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days before being granted absolution. But this dramatic scene was only a temporary truce, not a resolution. The underlying issue remained, and the struggle continued to poison relations between the papacy and the empire for another 45 years, through the reigns of subsequent popes and Henry's own son, Henry V. By the time Henry V and Pope Calixtus II found themselves at this impasse, both sides were exhausted. The constant conflict had weakened the emperor's control over his princes and had divided the loyalties of the clergy across Europe. It was clear that neither side could achieve a total victory without tearing Latin Christendom apart, and so, in 1122, they met in the city of Worms not for a confrontation, but for a negotiation. The document they produced, the Concordat of Worms, was a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise, a written agreement that finally drew a clear, lasting line between the spiritual and the temporal. Its genius was in its elegant, dualistic solution to the investiture problem, satisfying the core concerns of both parties without either having to admit total defeat. The terms of the Concordat were meticulously detailed, creating 2 distinct ceremonies for the installation of a bishop to reflect his 2 distinct roles. The emperor formally relinquished the ancient symbol of spiritual authority, the ring and the staff. These sacred objects would now be bestowed by the Pope or his representative in a ceremony of investiture, affirming that the bishop's spiritual power came directly from God through the Church. This was a monumental concession that granted the papacy the purity of appointment it had fought for. In return, however, the emperor retained a crucial secular role. The new bishop would then come before him for a separate ceremony to receive the sceptrum, the symbol of his temporal rights and lands. In this act, the bishop would do homage to the emperor as his feudal lord for the territories he governed. This preserved the emperor's essential feudal authority and ensured that his powerful vassals still owed him loyalty and military service. This delicate balance, so carefully codified in writing, was nothing short of revolutionary. It acknowledged a fundamental separation of powers that seems intuitive to us today, but was a radical concept at the time. The Concordat established the principle that a person could hold two offices, one spiritual, one temporal, and that the authority for each came from a different source. It created a model for the coexistence of church and state that would be studied and emulated across Europe for centuries. More immediately, it extinguished the fires of a conflict that had burned for 2 generations. By providing a clear, mutually acceptable legal framework, the Concordat of Worms allowed both the Empire and the Papacy to turn their attention away from fighting each other and toward governing their own domains. It proved that even the most bitter and entrenched ideological disputes could be resolved through the precise, thoughtful power of a negotiated text, a lesson in diplomacy that resonates just as powerfully today. But for all the high-stakes diplomacy that resolved conflicts between popes and emperors, the challenge of maintaining day-to-day order within a kingdom was a different matter entirely. Imagine England in the mid-12th century under the dynamic and driven King Henry II. The nation was a patchwork of powerful, semi-independent barons who often administered their own justice in their own courts, following local customs that could vary wildly from one valley to the next. This decentralized system was a direct threat to the crown's authority. A baron could effectively act as a petty king on his own lands, settling disputes with violence, protecting his favored allies, and ignoring the king's law when it suited him. This not only bred corruption and inconsistency, but also created pockets of resistance that could easily flare into open rebellion. For a king like Henry, who was determined to assert royal power and create a unified, peaceful realm, this was an intolerable situation. He couldn't be everywhere at once to personally enforce his will, and relying on his barons to do it for him was clearly failing. He needed a system, a written, standardized, and replicable system that could extend the long arm of the king's justice into every corner of his domain. Henry's brilliant solution was not to raise an army to crush his barons, but to summon his council and produce a document, the Assize of Clarendon in 1166. An assize simply means a session of a court or a decree issued from it, and this particular one was a groundbreaking piece of legislation. Its purpose was breathtakingly ambitious: to create a uniform, national standard for detecting and prosecuting serious crime. Before the assize, if a murder or robbery occurred, it was largely up to the local lord to investigate and punish the culprit, if he even bothered. The assize changed everything by making it a public duty, a responsibility owed to the king and the community itself. It established a revolutionary new process that would become the bedrock of the common law system. The king's own justices would travel out from his court on regular circuits, visiting counties across England. Upon their arrival, they were to summon a panel of 12 lawful men from every hundred and every village. These men were not witnesses in the modern sense. They were more like a community's conscience, sworn to report under oath any crimes they knew of or suspected, and to identify any individuals in their area who had a reputation for criminal behavior. This was the grand jury in its earliest form, a powerful tool for communal self-policing that bypassed the unreliable authority of the local baron. The accused individuals named by this jury then faced a new method of trial. The old, irrational methods of ordeal by fire or water, where guilt or innocence was determined by how a wound healed or if one floated, were still used, but now they were initiated by this new, more rational process of accusation. More importantly, the assize introduced and standardized the use of a jury to decide matters of land disputes through what were called possessory assizes, like the Assize of Tordesillas, which allowed a free man to quickly recover land that had been seized from him unlawfully. This was a monumental shift. It meant that a subject's right to his property was now protected by the king's law and the judgment of his peers, not by his own ability to muster a group of armed retainers to take it back. Justice was becoming a public service provided by the crown, something that could be accessed through a written procedure rather than seized through force. The impact of this single legislative script was profound. By creating a centralized royal system of justice that was arguably fairer and more reliable than the baronial courts, Henry II gave people a compelling reason to bring their disputes to the king's judges instead of their local lord. This steadily drained power away from the baronial class and funneled it toward the crown, all without Henry having to fight a single battle to achieve it. People began to see the king's court as the true source of justice and order. Furthermore, by relying on the sworn testimony of local communities, the Assize fostered a sense of collective responsibility for law and order. It wove the king's subjects into the very fabric of his government, making them active participants in maintaining the peace of the realm. The legal principles and procedures first codified at Clarendon would echo through the centuries, evolving into the jury trial system that remains a cornerstone of justice in many parts of the world today. It was a stunning demonstration that a well-crafted written law could be the most effective weapon a king could wield to build a stronger, more peaceful, and more unified nation. Yet for all the internal order that documents like the Assize of Clarendon could bring to a single kingdom, the most audacious script sought to rewrite the very map of Europe itself. And no document embodies this ambition more starkly than the Treaty of Troyes. To understand its breathtaking scope, we must first step into the chaos of the 100 Years' War in its final, brutal phase. By 1420, France was a nation on the brink of collapse. The catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Agincourt 5 years earlier had decimated the French nobility. The king, Charles VI, suffered from prolonged and severe bouts of mental illness that left him unable to rule, earning him the tragic epithet Charles the Mad. The country was torn apart by a vicious civil war between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, each vying for control of the vacant throne. Into this power vacuum stepped the young and phenomenally successful Henry V of England. He was not merely a foreign invader, he was a man with a dynastic claim to the French crown, and he was now capitalizing on France's internal divisions with ruthless efficiency. His military campaigns had brought him to the very gates of Paris. The French crown, it seemed, was his for the taking, but taking it by force would have required a long, bloody, and uncertain conquest of the entire realm. Instead, Henry chose a path that was both simpler and far more cunning. He would have it handed to him legally through a piece of parchment. The Treaty of Troyes was that parchment, and it remains one of the most astonishing diplomatic instruments in medieval history. Negotiated in the spring of 1420 in the city of Troyes, it was less a peace treaty between two nations and more a wholesale disinheritance of a royal line, accomplished through the cold, clean logic of legal language. The treaty's central provision was as simple as it was radical. It declared that upon the death of the ailing Charles VI, the crown of France would not pass to his own son, the Dauphin Charles. Instead, it would go to Henry V of England, who would rule as King of France, uniting the two crowns in a single person. To cement this outrageous transfer of power, Henry was to marry Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois, making him not just a conqueror but the king's own son-in-law and designated heir. In one masterful stroke, the treaty transformed Henry from a foreign enemy into the legitimate future ruler of France, all according to the laws of succession and the authority of the sitting monarch. It was a breathtaking act of political jiu-jitsu, using the very legitimacy of the French crown to authorize its own surrender. This was only possible because Henry had secured a powerful ally within the French camp, Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. The Burgundians were locked in a bitter feud with the Armagnacs, who supported the Dauphin. For Philip, aligning with the English king was a strategic move to destroy his domestic rivals. He effectively acted as the broker for the treaty, using his influence over the incapacitated Charles VI to get the document sealed. The treaty, therefore, was also a product of civil war, a testament to how internal fractures could be exploited by an external power to achieve through a signature what might have taken a decade of campaigning to win on the battlefield. It granted Henry everything he could have wanted: legitimacy, a royal marriage, and a clear path to the throne, all while isolating and branding the Dauphin Charles as a disinherited rebel against his own father's will. For a few short years, the Treaty of Troyes seemed to have succeeded. Henry entered Paris not as a besieger but as a regent and heir apparent, ruling France alongside Charles VI. The relentless warfare ceased. The dual monarchy of England and France became a political reality on paper, a dynastic union that promised to end the conflict forever. But the treaty's greatest strength was also its fatal flaw. It was a script written for a specific cast of characters, and it could not survive their departure from the stage. When both Henry V and Charles VI died within months of each other in 1422, the entire legal edifice crumbled. The treaty had designated Henry's infant son, Henry VI, as the new king of both England and France, but the Dauphin Charles and his supporters naturally rejected this outright. They argued that the treaty was illegal, signed under duress by a king who was not in his right mind, and that the fundamental laws of France prohibited the crown from passing through a woman, which was the very basis of Henry's claim through his wife. The war erupted once more, now fueled by a constitutional crisis over the meaning of the document itself. The ultimate failure of the Treaty of Troyes to create a lasting Anglo-French union does not diminish its significance. In fact, it amplifies it. The treaty stands as the supreme example of how a written accord could be weaponized in high-stakes diplomacy. It was an attempt to win a war not by destroying the enemy's army, but by erasing their legitimacy. It shows us the immense power of a document to reshape reality, to make a king out of an invader, and to turn a prince into an outlaw, all through the careful arrangement of clauses and promises. Its complexities reveal the limits of such power as well, demonstrating that even the most brilliantly crafted script cannot always control the unpredictable currents of human mortality, national identity, and the stubborn will of those who refuse to accept its terms. The Treaty of Troyes was a gambit of unparalleled ambition, a piece forged from the most audacious fiction of all, that the future of a nation could be decided not on the field of battle, but at the negotiating table. While the Treaty of Troyes was a pragmatic document aimed at a specific political outcome, our next script represents a far more abstract and philosophical form of power, the power of an idea declared with absolute certainty. To understand the explosive impact of the papal bull Unam Sanctam, we need to step back into the turbulent world of the early 14th century. This was an era where the long-standing, if often tense, partnership between the papacy and European monarchies was beginning to fracture. Kings were growing stronger, building centralized administrations and national armies that made them less reliant on and less tolerant of papal authority. The stage was set for a direct confrontation over the ultimate question: who held the highest power on earth? Was it the spiritual leader in Rome or the anointed king in his own realm? This ideological clash found its ultimate expression in a bitter feud between one of the most assertive popes in history, Boniface VIII, and one of the most cunning and ruthless kings of France, Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. The immediate spark was a familiar one: money. Philip, engaged in a costly war with England, sought to tax the immense wealth of the French clergy to fund his efforts. To Boniface, this was not just a financial imposition. It was a blatant violation of clerical immunity and a direct challenge to the Church's independence. He responded with a series of increasingly angry letters and bulls, culminating in the most famous and defiant of them all, Unam Sanctam, issued in November of 1302. This was not a negotiation or a diplomatic memo. It was a theological and political manifesto, a declaration of principles so absolute it left no room for compromise. The bull's very title, meaning one holy, came from its opening line about the unity of the Church, but its content was a full-throated assertion of papal supremacy that went further than any document before it. Unam Sanctam is built upon a powerful and intricate metaphor, the two swords doctrine. This ancient idea held that God had granted two swords for the governance of the world, the spiritual sword and the temporal sword. The bull argued that both swords ultimately belonged to the Church. The spiritual sword was to be wielded by the Church itself, while the temporal sword was to be wielded for the Church by secular rulers, but only under the Church's direction and supervision. Boniface took this metaphor to its logical extreme, declaring that while the temporal authority had its own sphere of action, it must always be subject to the spiritual power. And who was the ultimate judge of that spiritual power? The Pope. The bull's most famous and uncompromising line delivered the final, thunderous conclusion. Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff. In a single sentence, Boniface had inextricably linked political obedience to spiritual salvation. To defy the Pope was not just an act of rebellion, it was an act that risked one's immortal soul. This was the ultimate ideological weapon, a claim to authority that sought to bind the conscience of every Christian king and subject alike. The reaction from King Philip was not one of theological debate, but of cold, hard political counterattack. He had no intention of submitting to this bold declaration. Instead, he orchestrated a ruthless campaign to discredit and destroy Boniface. His ministers flooded Europe with propaganda portraying the Pope as a heretic, a sorcerer, and a tyrant. In a stunningly audacious move, Philip sent a small force led by his minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, to seize the Pope at his summer residence in Anagni, Italy. The aged Boniface was allegedly slapped and held prisoner for several days before the local people rose up and freed him. The shock and humiliation of this affront, known as the outrage of Anagni, broke Boniface's spirit. He died just a month later. In the immediate sense, it seemed like a total victory for the secular power. Philip had effectively called the Pope's bluff and demonstrated that a determined king with a loyal army could physically overpower the vicar of Christ. Yet, to see this only as the story of a pope's defeat is to miss the profound and lasting influence of Unam Sanctam. While Boniface lost the personal battle, the ideological war he ignited with his bull raged on for centuries. The document became a foundational text for the theory of papal monarchy, a touchstone for all future popes who sought to assert their authority in political matters. More importantly, it forced every serious political thinker in Europe to grapple with its arguments. The sheer audacity of its claims provoked a wave of counter-arguments from lawyers, philosophers, and theologians who wrote tracts defending the independence and divine right of kings. This fierce intellectual debate, fueled by the bull's uncompromising rhetoric, helped to slowly carve out the modern concept of the secular state, a realm where temporal authority could operate independently of direct religious control. Unam Sanctam, by stating the papal position in its most extreme form, actually accelerated the development of the very political theories that would eventually limit its power. It proved that a document need not be successful in its immediate goals to be transformative. Sometimes, the most powerful scripts are those that draw a line in the sand so bold that they force the entire world to choose a side, and in doing so, redefine the landscape of power forever. Yet, even as popes and emperors clashed over the highest questions of authority, a quieter but no less significant revolution was unfolding within the realm of England, one that would plant the seed for a much more famous document over a century later. The year is 1100, and the English throne has just been seized in a breathtakingly swift and controversial act. William II, known as William Rufus, is dead, killed by an arrow in a hunting accident in the New Forest under circumstances that many found deeply suspicious. His younger brother, Henry, was in the hunting party that day. Instead of waiting for the return of his eldest brother, Robert Curthose, the rightful heir who was away on the First Crusade, Henry raced to Winchester to secure the royal treasury and then to London, where he had himself crowned king within just 3 days. It was a brazen, arguably illegitimate power grab. Henry I now sat on a profoundly unstable throne. He faced the imminent threat of invasion from Robert, who would surely return to claim his birthright, and he could not count on the automatic support of the powerful English barons, who were weary of the chaotic and oppressive rule of the late William Rufus and saw the succession crisis as a chance to advance their own interests. Henry's response to this precarious situation was a masterstroke of political genius. He did not immediately raise an army or impose his will through fear. Instead, he issued a script. At his coronation on August 5, 1100, he presented the nation with a written promise, the Charter of Liberties. This document was a direct and deliberate repudiation of his brother's unpopular policies. Where William Rufus had been accused of extorting money, selling church offices, and abusing feudal customs for his own gain, Henry's charter presented a new king's pledge to rule with justice and moderation. It was, in essence, a coronation manifesto designed to win hearts and minds and build a coalition of support at the most vulnerable moment of his reign. He was effectively negotiating his own legitimacy with his new subjects, using a written text as his chief instrument of diplomacy. The specific promises within the Charter of Liberties were carefully tailored to address the most pressing grievances of the two most powerful pillars of society, the Church and the barons. To the Church, still reeling from William Rufus's practice of keeping bishoprics empty so he could pocket their revenues, Henry made a solemn vow. He promised to end this abuse, declaring that he would not sell or lease church properties and that he would not take church revenues after a bishop's death. This immediately secured him the crucial backing of the clergy. To the barons, he addressed their financial grievances. He promised to abolish the hated and oppressive practices that William had used to milk them of their wealth. Most importantly, he vowed to avoid the abusive use of feudal incidents, the financial rights a lord had over his vassals. He promised not to charge exorbitant sums for the inheritance of estates, not to demand excessive payments for the marriage of a baron's daughter, and not to seize a baron's land while his heir was underage, instead placing the estate under the protection of a relative of the family. For the common people, he made a broader pledge to restore the law of King Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king, whose reign was remembered as a golden age of good law, with just taxes and fair justice. The brilliance of Henry's strategy lay in its tangible, written form. This was not just a vague speech or a whispered promise. It was a formal charter, sealed and distributed. It created a concrete record of his commitments, a standard against which his future rule could be measured. The barons and bishops now had something to hold onto, a written guarantee that gave them confidence in supporting this new and unproven king. This document provided the stability Henry desperately needed to consolidate his power and prepare for the inevitable conflict with his brother Robert. When Robert did finally invade England the following year, Henry was able to defeat him, in no small part because he had successfully secured his home front through the promises enshrined in the Charter. While the Charter of Liberties was a product of its time and was not endlessly renewed like the Magna Carta would be, its legacy is immense. It established a powerful and revolutionary precedent that a king's power could be, and perhaps should be, limited by his own public promises. It created the template for a bargain between the ruler and the ruled, suggesting that loyalty was not unconditional but was contingent on the crown upholding its end of a deal. Most importantly, it proved that a written document could be the perfect vehicle for sealing such a bargain. It provided clarity, permanence, and a sense of solemn obligation. 75 years later, when another group of barons faced another tyrannical king, they would not be starting from scratch. They would remember Henry's charter, and they would demand their own, more famous, written guarantee. The Charter of Liberties was the quiet, foundational script that first planted the idea in English political life that governance was a negotiation, and that the most powerful tool in that negotiation could be a piece of parchment filled with carefully chosen words. While the Treaty of Troyes sought to merge two crowns and Unam Sanctam declared spiritual supremacy, some of the most enduring scripts were those that built bridges rather than empires. In the late 14th century, both England and Portugal found themselves in positions that required not conquest but clever friends. England, under Richard II, was still grappling with the aftermath of the 100 Years' War and the social upheaval that followed the Black Death. It was a kingdom in need of stable allies to counterbalance the constant threat from France. Portugal, under King John I, was a young dynasty fighting for its very survival. Only a few years earlier, John had secured the throne by defeating the Castilians at the pivotal Battle of El Jubarrota, but the victory did not erase the danger. The powerful kingdom of Castile still loomed on its eastern border, hungry to absorb its smaller neighbor. For Portugal, a reliable ally was not a matter of convenience, it was an existential necessity. It was in this climate of mutual need that the two kingdoms turned to diplomacy, producing in 1386 one of the most remarkable and enduring documents in diplomatic history, the Treaty of Windsor. This was not a fleeting pact or a temporary truce. The treaty was a meticulously detailed, comprehensive agreement that wove the two nations together across multiple fronts. Its genius lay in its holistic approach to alliance, recognizing that a true partnership required more than just a promise to fight together. At its heart was a powerful mutual defense clause, a solemn vow that if either kingdom were attacked, the other would come to its aid with military force. For Portugal, this was a guarantee against Castilian aggression, a written assurance that the English longbowmen, the most feared infantry in Europe, would stand beside them. For England, it secured a strategic foothold on the continent and a valuable ally who could threaten France from the south, opening a potential second front in any future conflict. But the treaty's architects understood that military alliances built on sentiment alone are fragile. To make the bond truly unbreakable, they fortified it with deep economic and social ties. The treaty established extraordinarily favorable conditions for trade between the two kingdoms. English merchants were granted special privileges in Portuguese ports, and Portuguese goods received similar treatment in England. This created a powerful constituency of merchants and nobles in both countries who had a direct financial stake in maintaining peace and friendship. Money, as much as military might, would cement the alliance. Furthermore, the treaty encouraged a profound cultural and social exchange. It promoted marriages between the English and Portuguese nobility, weaving the aristocratic families of both lands together with bonds of blood and kinship. It facilitated the movement of scholars, artists, and craftsmen, creating a shared cultural landscape that reinforced political solidarity. This wasn't just a contract between two monarchs, it was a blueprint for integrating two societies, making them interdependent in ways that went far beyond the battlefield. The immediate success of the treaty was proven just a few years later, in 1387, when John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster and uncle to King Richard II, launched a military campaign to press his own claim to the Castilian throne. He did so with a powerful Portuguese army fighting alongside his English troops. This joint campaign, made possible by the Treaty of Windsor, demonstrated the practical power of the alliance in real time. But the true testament to this document's power is its breathtaking longevity. While nearly every other alliance of the medieval period frayed, broke, or was forgotten within a generation, the Treaty of Windsor endured. It was invoked, renewed, and reaffirmed over the centuries that followed. English troops fought for Portugal against Castile again in the 17th century. During the Napoleonic Wars, it was the British Army, led by the Duke of Wellington, that helped defend Portugal from French invasion, a direct fulfillment of those ancient pledges. Even today, it is recognized as the oldest active treaty alliance in the entire world, a fact that is almost incomprehensible given the turbulent history of European diplomacy. The Treaty of Windsor stands as a masterclass in strategic foresight. It demonstrates that the most powerful international scripts are those that build a web of connections so dense and mutually beneficial that breaking them becomes unthinkable. It moved beyond a simple promise of military aid to create a lasting community of interest, binding two nations together through commerce, culture, and kinship. In a world so often defined by the clash of armies, this document achieved something far more difficult and rare. It forged a peace that lasted for centuries, proving that a well-written treaty could be the strongest fortress of all. Frederick II was a ruler so extraordinary to his contemporaries that he was known as Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world. Crowned Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, he was a paradox, a German ruler born and raised in Italy, a Christian monarch who spoke fluent Arabic and maintained a harem, a crusader who negotiated the peaceful handover of Jerusalem while excommunicated by the Pope. His mind was a whirlwind of intellectual curiosity, fascinated by science, law, and falconry in equal measure. But perhaps his most enduring legacy, the one that truly stunned the world, was not a military campaign or a religious feat, but a book of laws. When he ascended to the throne of the Kingdom of Sicily, he inherited a realm that was as culturally dazzling as it was politically chaotic. The island and southern Italy were a vibrant mosaic of Norman, Lombard, Greek, and Arab influences, each with their own ancient customs and legal traditions. Local barons wielded immense power, administering their own justice and collecting their own taxes, often acting as independent princes who merely offered lip service to the crown. The kingdom was in effect a collection of fragmented territories held together by a loose and often ignored feudal loyalty. For a mind like Frederick's, which thrived on order, reason, and systemization, this was an intolerable situation. He envisioned a modern, centralized state, a well-oiled machine that ran on the engine of royal law rather than the whims of 100 different nobles. To achieve this, he did not embark on a bloody campaign of subjugation. Instead, he summoned the greatest legal minds of his age to the town of Melfi in 1231 and presented them with a monumental task to codify, rationalize, and unify the entire legal system of his kingdom into a single, comprehensive document. The result was the Constitutions of Melfi, a legal code so advanced, so detailed, and so revolutionary that it would not look out of place in a much later era. The scope of this document was breathtaking. It was not a simple list of rules, it was a complete blueprint for governance, touching every single aspect of public and private life. It covered criminal law, civil law, feudal obligations, trade regulations, public health, and even university administration. Its primary objective was crystal clear: to make the king the sole source of authority and law throughout the land. One of its most radical innovations was the creation of a professional, salaried royal judiciary. Frederick appointed judges directly, paying them from the royal treasury. This simple act was a masterstroke. It broke the barons' monopoly on local justice, as these royal judges traveled circuits hearing cases based on the new, standardized laws rather than on variable local customs. For the first time, a peasant or a merchant could seek justice from a court that represented the king's law, not their local lord's favoritism. This gave subjects a powerful alternative and a reason to be loyal to the distant crown, steadily eroding the baron's power without a single castle being besieged. The constitutions also tackled the lifeblood of any medieval state, money. Frederick established a centralized financial system, standardizing weights and measures across the kingdom, and creating a more efficient method of tax collection that bypassed the nobles and flowed directly into the royal coffers. This wealth, in turn, funded his reforms, paying for his judges, his officials, and his standing army. Another key innovation. The laws stipulated that military service was owed directly to the king, not to an intermediate baron. This meant Frederick could raise a powerful, loyal force answerable only to him, a crucial tool for enforcing his will and deterring rebellion. Beyond administration, the code revealed Frederick's remarkably modern and pragmatic mind. It included provisions for state-controlled medical licensing to ensure doctors were qualified, laws protecting Jews and Muslims from persecution to maintain economic stability, and even regulations on the export of grain to prevent famines. Every clause was designed to impose order, reason, and royal control from the top down. The impact of the constitutions of Melfi was profound. They transformed the Kingdom of Sicily into the most advanced, bureaucratically sophisticated state in all of Europe, a beacon of centralized power that would become the envy and model for later absolutist monarchs. They demonstrated that a ruler could consolidate immense authority not through brute force, but through the meticulous and relentless application of written law. Frederick had used his quill to build a cage of legal obligations around his most powerful subjects, constraining their independence with paragraphs and clauses instead of chains and walls. He proved that the most effective way to rule a kingdom was not to command an army, but to author its instruction manual. While Frederick II was using the constitutions of Melfi to centralize power in his own hands, a very different story was unfolding far to the northeast in the Kingdom of Hungary. Here, the challenge was not a lack of royal authority, but an excess of it, and a nobility that was no longer willing to tolerate it. King Andrew II, who came to the throne in 1205, is a figure often described by historians as a kleptocrat. His reign was a masterclass in financial mismanagement and reckless ambition. He was a man with grand designs, most notably a series of enormously expensive and ultimately disastrous military campaigns, including a crusade to the Holy Land that achieved little beyond draining his treasury. To fund these ventures and his extravagantly lavish court, Andrew resorted to desperate measures. He debased the currency, causing inflation to skyrocket. He sold off vast swaths of the royal demesne, the crown lands that were the primary source of the monarchy's income and power, to his wealthy supporters, effectively mortgaging the kingdom's future. Worst of all, he imposed crippling and arbitrary taxes on his nobles, while handing out high offices and privileges to a small circle of foreign favorites, particularly a group of influential courtiers from Italy and Germany. This combination of fiscal irresponsibility, favoritism, and the alienation of the royal estate pushed the native Hungarian nobility to the brink of open revolt. They were not just angry, they were witnessing the very foundations of their wealth and the kingdom's stability being sold off from under them. The discontent reached a boiling point in 1222. A powerful coalition of nobles from the highest magnates to the lesser knights, united by their shared grievance against the crown, finally decided to act. But unlike in many other medieval realms, their first resort was not to draw their swords. Instead, they drew up a list of demands. They confronted their king not on a battlefield, but in a field near Buda, using their collective power to force a negotiation. Andrew, recognizing he was cornered and facing the very real threat of deposition or civil war, had no choice but to listen. The result of this high-pressure summit was the Golden Bull of 1222, a document that takes its name from the golden seal, or bulla, used to authenticate it. This was not a gift granted graciously by a benevolent monarch. It was a contract extracted by his powerful subjects, a written constitution that permanently redefined the relationship between the crown and the nobility. The content of the bull was a direct response to Andrew's specific abuses, and its clauses were designed to prevent them from ever happening again. It was, in essence, a bill of rights for the noble class. First and foremost, it addressed the king's financial predation. It declared that nobles were exempt from all taxes and could not be forced to finance military campaigns outside of the kingdom's borders, effectively putting a halt to Andrew's expensive foreign adventures. It guaranteed that no noble could be arrested or punished without a proper trial and judgment by his peers, protecting them from arbitrary imprisonment at the king's whim. In a move that resonates with the later Magna Carta, it even included a clause that granted the nobles the right to resist the king without punishment if he failed to uphold the terms of the bull, a remarkable early assertion of a right to rebellion. Furthermore, it sought to end the corrupt influence of foreign favorites at court, stipulating that only native Hungarians could hold high official positions. Each of these provisions was a deliberate shackle placed on royal power, a written guarantee designed to force the king to govern with the consent of the governed, or at least the governed who mattered most in feudal society. The true genius of the Golden Bull, however, was not just in its specific restrictions, but in the lasting framework it created. It established a delicate but durable balance of power. The king remained the sovereign, but his authority was now conditional upon his observance of the law as defined in the document. The nobles, in turn, received clearly defined liberties and a legal mechanism to protect them. This created a system of mutual obligations and accountability that prevented the kind of autocratic excess that had sparked the crisis in the first place. It channeled political conflict into a legal and parliamentary arena rather than leaving it to be settled by violence. The bull's legacy endured for centuries precisely because it was not a temporary fix, it was a foundational compact. It was confirmed and reaffirmed by subsequent Hungarian monarchs upon their coronation, becoming a cornerstone of the Hungarian constitution and a symbol of the nation's unique tradition of feudal liberty. It laid the groundwork for a powerful noble parliament, the Diet, which would go on to play a crucial role in Hungarian politics for hundreds of years. In a volatile region often dominated by powerful autocrats, the Golden Bull of Hungary stood as a powerful early example of how a written agreement could forge a path toward stability, not by concentrating power in one place, but by wisely and clearly distributing it. Yet while grand emperors and powerful kings were reshaping continents with their legal codes and treaties, a quieter, more personal form of diplomatic recognition was unfolding in the rugged mountains of Wales, a story not of conquest but of a hard-won title inscribed on parchment. For centuries, the relationship between the English crown and the native Welsh princes had been a cycle of brutal invasion, fragile submission, and inevitable rebellion. The Welsh, fiercely protective of their independence and ancient laws, had resisted complete assimilation into the Norman-dominated Kingdom of England through a combination of guerrilla warfare and shrewd diplomacy. By the mid-13th century, a remarkable leader emerged who seemed poised to finally unite Wales under a single banner: Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, grandson of the great Llewellyn the Great. Through a combination of military skill and strategic marriages, Llewellyn had expanded his control until he effectively ruled over the majority of Welsh lords. He wasn't just a regional chieftain, he was the de facto leader of a nation. But de facto power is a fragile thing without formal, international recognition. For Llewellyn, that legitimacy could only come from one source: the King of England himself. The English king at this time, Henry III, was in a weakened position. His reign had been marred by internal strife, including a failed military campaign in France and a devastating civil war with his own barons, known as the Second Barons' War. His authority was stretched thin, his treasury was depleted, and the last thing he needed was a costly, drawn-out war in the difficult terrain of the Welsh mountains. Llewellyn, ever the astute politician, saw his opportunity. He had skillfully supported the rebel barons during Henry's civil war, not out of ideological kinship, but as a way to pressure the English crown. With the war concluded and Henry eager to secure his realm, Llewellyn was in a position to negotiate from strength. The stage was set for a diplomatic solution rather than a military one. In 1267, the two sides met at Montgomery, a key border fortress, not to fight, but to sign a document that would fundamentally alter the status of Wales. The Treaty of Montgomery was a triumph for Llewellyn. In its carefully worded clauses, Henry III did something no English king had ever done before. He formally recognized Llewellyn ap Gruffydd not merely as a powerful Welsh lord, but as the Prince of Wales. This was a title laden with immense symbolic and legal weight. It acknowledged Llewellyn's preeminence over the other Welsh rulers, effectively making him their feudal superior and the sole representative of Wales in dealings with England. In return for this monumental concession, Llewellyn agreed to swear fealty to Henry as his overlord and to pay a substantial sum of 25,000 marks. A huge indemnity that was essentially the price of his new title. For Henry, this was a pragmatic masterstroke. He secured the formal submission of the most powerful man in Wales without having to spend a fortune and spill English blood in a risky campaign. He gained a stable, recognized frontier and the homage of a prince, which bolstered his own prestige. The treaty transformed a volatile and violent borderland into a defined feudal relationship, governed by the clear terms of a written agreement. For a few glorious years, the Treaty of Montgomery seemed to have achieved the impossible. Llewellyn ap Gruffydd ruled a Wales more united and autonomous than it had been in centuries, his authority legitimized by his sworn enemy. He held court, issued laws, and styled himself as a sovereign prince in all but name. The document had successfully used the language of diplomacy to create a new political reality, proving that a kingdom could be acknowledged into existence through the power of a signature and a seal. But the peace it brokered was tragically short-lived. Henry III died just 5 years later, and his successor was a king of a completely different character, his son, Edward I. Edward, known as the Hammer of the Scots, was a ruthlessly efficient soldier and a firm believer in the direct, centralized rule of the entire British Isles. He had no patience for the semi-independent principality his father's treaty had created. When Llewellyn, citing his official title, refused to perform the full acts of homage Edward demanded, the new king saw it not as a diplomatic misunderstanding, but as an act of rebellion. Edward used the financial terms of the treaty itself as his pretext for war, claiming Llewellyn was in arrears on his payments. He invaded Wales with overwhelming force, launching a brutal campaign that ended with Llewellyn's death in an ambush in 1282 and the complete subjugation of Wales. The dream of an autonomous Wales, born from the Treaty of Montgomery, was extinguished in a wave of iron and blood. Yet the treaty's failure does not erase its profound significance. Its true power lay in the precedent it set. For the first time, an English crown had been forced to negotiate with a Welsh ruler as a near equal, and to formally acknowledge the concept of a unified Welsh polity. This idea that Wales was a nation deserving of recognition did not die with Llewellyn. It lived on in the memory of the Welsh people and in their legal and historical traditions. The title Prince of Wales was so potent that Edward I would later steal its power, bestowing it upon his own infant son to signify English dominance. But the ghost of Llewellyn's principality would haunt the relationship between England and Wales for centuries, fueling later rebellions and eventually contributing to the modern-day movement for Welsh devolution. The Treaty of Montgomery stands as a poignant testament to the power and the limits of a recognition script. It shows that a document can momentarily bend the arc of history toward justice and self-determination, creating a new reality through words alone. But it also serves as a sobering reminder that without the power to defend that reality, the most beautifully written treaty is ultimately just ink on a page. But if the Treaty of Montgomery was a script of high diplomacy, our next document reveals the power of the written word to manage a crisis of an entirely different and far more terrifying scale, a catastrophe that struck at the very foundations of society itself. The year is 1349, and England is a land utterly transformed, but not for the better. The Black Death has swept across the country in a series of horrific waves, leaving behind a landscape of unimaginable grief and desolation. Contemporary chroniclers, struggling to comprehend the scale of the loss, estimated that nearly half the population had perished. Entire villages stood empty, their fields falling fallow. The social and economic order, which had been so rigid and predictable for centuries, was suddenly turned completely upside down. The most profound change was in the value of human labor. For generations, a vast pool of cheap, readily available workers had been the engine of the manorial system. Lords owned the land and serfs were bound to it, owing labor and goods in exchange for protection and the right to work a small strip for themselves. It was a system built on an abundance of people and a scarcity of land. In the blink of an eye, the plague had reversed this equation. Now, land was abundant, but people were desperately scarce. This new reality created an unprecedented opportunity for the surviving peasants and laborers. Their skills were suddenly in incredibly high demand. If a lord wanted his fields plowed, his sheep sheared, or his castle repaired, he now had to compete with his neighbors for a tiny pool of available workers. This gave the lower classes a bargaining power they had never known before. They could demand higher wages for their work, or simply leave their home manor for a neighboring estate that offered better pay and conditions. For the landowning classes, the barons, knights, and gentry, this was not just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat to their entire way of life. Their wealth was derived from the produce of their land, which was now rotting in the fields for lack of hands to harvest it. the skyrocketing cost of labor was eviscerating their profits. They watched in horror as the traditional social hierarchy, with them firmly at the top, began to crumble. The fear was not just economic, it was social and political. If peasants could become wealthy and mobile, what would stop them from demanding more rights? How could the aristocracy maintain its control? The country was teetering on the brink of a complete economic breakdown, which everyone knew could easily spiral into widespread social unrest and violent conflict between the classes. It was into this volatile and panicked atmosphere that the royal government, led by King Edward III, stepped in with a radical and unprecedented response. Instead of sending out sheriffs and soldiers to force people back to work at the point of a sword, they turned to the power of legislation. They summoned Parliament and produced a script, the Ordinance of Labourers of 1349. This document was a breathtaking attempt to use the force of law to roll back time, to command the economic tides to reverse themselves. Its central premise was simple and brutally direct. It sought to freeze the economy in its pre-plague state. The ordinance began by lamenting the audacity of laborers who were refusing to work except for excessive wages, and it declared a solution. It mandated that all able-bodied men and women under the age of 60, who did not have their own means of support, must accept work at the same wage rates that were customary in the year 1246, the year before the plague had arrived. This was not a suggestion, it was a legally enforceable cap on wages, an attempt to legislate away the laws of supply and demand. But the ordinance went much further than just controlling pay. It was a comprehensive attempt to reassert control over a mobile and emboldened workforce. It made it illegal for a laborer to leave his home village to seek better employment elsewhere. If a worker did accept a higher wage from a desperate lord, both the worker and the lord who hired him could be punished with heavy fines. To enforce these radical new rules, the ordinance created a new system of local officials. The king appointed special justices of laborers in every county who were empowered to hold inquiries, hear complaints, and punish offenders. These justices were to be drawn from the very class that stood to benefit most from the law, the local landowning gentry. In effect, the crown was deputizing the lords to police their own economic interests, creating a legal framework for them to collectively suppress the wages of their workers. The immediate goal of the ordinance was clear: to prevent the total economic collapse of the landed class and to maintain the existing social structure by any means necessary. And in the short term, it was a remarkable act of crisis management. It provided a legal outlet for the panic and frustration of the aristocracy, channeling their desire for control into a state-sanctioned process rather than into private, violent retribution against rebellious peasants. It created a semblance of order and gave the government a tool to try and stabilize a spiraling situation. However, the long-term effectiveness of the ordinance is a different story. The economic forces unleashed by the plague were simply too powerful to be contained by a piece of parchment. The demand for labor was a fact of life, and lords who were desperate to bring in their harvests continued to quietly offer higher wages under the table. The law proved incredibly difficult to enforce uniformly across the country, and many justices were lax in their duties. Yet, the true historical significance of the Ordinance of Laborers is not in its success or failure, but in what it represents. It is a stunning example of a government using a written script as its primary tool for managing a societal catastrophe. Faced with a disaster that threatened to tear the nation apart, the Crown did not just rely on force, it turned to the power of lawmaking. It attempted to use a legislative document to dictate economic reality and preserve the social order. This set a powerful precedent for the role of the state in regulating the economy, a concept that would evolve over the coming centuries. Furthermore, the ordinance's harsh measures had an unintended consequence. They sowed deep seeds of resentment among the working classes. The constant attempts to enforce these unfair laws, which were so blatantly designed to benefit the rich, became a major grievance. This simmering anger would eventually boil over a generation later in the seismic shock of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where one of the rebels' key demands was the abolition of the labor laws. The Ordinance of Laborers, therefore, stands as a profound lesson. It shows how a written decree can be a government's first and most powerful response to a crisis, an attempt to impose control through words rather than weapons. But it also serves as a warning that a script which ignores fundamental human and economic realities may stifle a conflict in the short term, only to plant the seeds for a much greater explosion in the future. Yet, even as governments struggled to control the social upheaval at home, the relentless grind of international conflict continued unabated. The 100 Years' War between England and France was by the 1360s a wearying, generations-long struggle that had drained both kingdoms of men, money, and morale. The conflict had reached a startling climax just a few years earlier with the English victory at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, a battle that seemed to defy all logic. King John II of France, leading a massive and confident army, had been not only defeated but captured in his entirety by the Black Prince, the son of England's Edward III. The French king was now a prized prisoner in London, a living symbol of English military supremacy and French humiliation. But a captured king creates a peculiar problem. He is both an immense bargaining chip and an enormous liability. For Edward III, holding John was a strategic masterstroke, but it was also incredibly expensive. The king had to be housed, fed, and guarded in a manner befitting his royal status. More importantly, his absence created a power vacuum in France that was rapidly filling with chaos. John's son and heir, the Dauphin Charles, was left to rule a nation teetering on the brink of collapse, its countryside ravaged by mercenary bands and its authority challenged by a rebellious peasantry in the Jacquerie uprising. Both sides were exhausted, but neither could afford to lose face. They were trapped in a bloody stalemate that seemed to have no end. It was into this atmosphere of mutual exhaustion that the Treaty of Picquigny was born, not on a battlefield, but across a negotiating table in the small town of Bretigny-sur-Noye in 1360. This document stands as one of the most detailed and ambitious peace scripts of the entire medieval period. A breathtaking attempt to use the power of written clauses to literally redraw the map of Western Europe and buy a generation of peace. The treaty's architects understood that a simple truce would not be enough. They needed a comprehensive settlement that addressed the core grievances driving the conflict. At its heart were two monumental transactions, one of territory and one of money. In exchange for the release of King John, the French crown agreed to cede an astonishingly vast portion of its territory to England. This was not just a few border castles, it was a huge swath of land encompassing almost the entire ancient duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France, plus key territories like Calais, Ponthieu, and Poitou. In one stroke of a pen, Edward III's dominion in France was transformed from a collection of contested feudal holdings into a sprawling, contiguous coastal empire. The map was fundamentally rewritten, creating an English-controlled zone that dwarfed anything the Plantagenets had held since the time of Henry II 2 centuries prior. But land was only half of the equation. The treaty also imposed a staggering ransom for King John's freedom, 3 million gold écus. To put this almost unimaginable sum into perspective, it was roughly equivalent to twice the annual revenue of the entire French crown. The payment terms were laid out with meticulous precision, specifying installments and deadlines, turning the release of the king into a financial transaction of epic proportions. However, the true diplomatic genius of Picquigny lay in a subtle but critical legal clause buried within its terms. In a masterstroke of compromise, Edward III agreed to formally renounce his claim to the French throne, a dynastic ambition that had been the original casus belli for the entire war. In return, the French crown agreed to renounce all sovereignty over the territories now ceded to England. This was the key to a lasting peace. It meant that Edward would no longer hold these lands as a rebellious vassal of the French king, a relationship that had always been a recipe for conflict, but as their full and absolute sovereign. The Treaty of Picquigny aimed to resolve the Anglo-French conflict not by having one side conquer the other, but by legally disentangling them, creating two separate and independent spheres of power. For nearly a decade, the treaty held. This 9-year period of peace, known as the Peace of Picquigny-Calais, provided both nations with a desperately needed respite. King John was released after an initial payment was made, though he would later voluntarily return to English captivity when a hostage escaped, dying in London in 1364, a story of chivalric honor taken to a tragic extreme. In France, the Dauphin Charles used this breathing room to consolidate his power, rebuild his army, and implement crucial tax reforms that would eventually fill his war chest. He was no longer the leader of a nation on the verge of disintegration, but a king in waiting, preparing for the next round. In England, Edward III enjoyed the glory and the revenues of his vast new continental possessions. The treaty was a personal triumph for him, a validation of his military campaigns achieved through diplomatic means. Of course, we know the peace did not last. The treaty's fatal flaw was its own complexity. The renunciations of sovereignty, the very heart of the agreement, were never formally exchanged. Legalistic delays and disagreements over the final terms meant that the fundamental transfer of allegiance was never completed, leaving the door open for future French kings to reassert their authority over the ceded territories. When Charles V, a shrewd and determined ruler, ascended the French throne, he began to chip away at the English holdings, arguing that the treaty's terms had not been fully met. The war eventually resumed with a new fury, but to judge the Treaty of Picquigny solely by its ultimate failure is to miss its profound significance. It demonstrated with stunning clarity that even the most intractable wars could be paused and even seemingly resolved through the intricate power of a negotiated text. It showed that diplomacy could achieve what decades of warfare could not: a voluntary reconfiguration of an entire continent's political landscape. The treaty provided both kingdoms with the vital time they needed to recover, reorganize, and ultimately continue their epic struggle. It stands as a monumental testament to the idea that the most powerful weapon in a ruler's arsenal might not be a longbow, but a well-drafted clause. While the monarchs of Western Europe were steadily consolidating power, moving toward the absolute rule that would define the early modern period, a vast and powerful federation in the East was charting a radically different course. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, born from the union of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in 1569, was a behemoth. At its peak, it stretched from the Baltic Sea almost to the Black Sea, encompassing a dazzling diversity of cultures, languages, and religions. Governing such a sprawling and varied realm presented a unique challenge, one that could not be managed by the iron fist of a single, all-powerful monarch. Instead, the nobility of this commonwealth, a class known as the Szlachta, crafted a political system so extraordinary, so counterintuitive to the trends of its time, that it remains a fascinating historical anomaly. This system was codified in a series of laws and traditions collectively known as the Golden Liberty, and its most foundational script was the Henrician Articles of 1573, a document that would make every future king of Poland the most constitutionally constrained ruler in all of Europe. The context for this revolutionary document was a moment of profound crisis and opportunity. The Jagiellonian dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, had died out with King Sigismund Roman II Augustus in 1572. For the first time, the throne was completely vacant, and the powerful, proud, and deeply independent nobility had no intention of simply accepting a hereditary successor. This was their chance to fundamentally redefine the relationship between the crown and the citizenry, or at least the citizenry who mattered in their eyes, which was the extensive noble class. When the assembled nobles gathered for the first free election to choose a new king, they did not merely vote, they negotiated. The chosen candidate was Henry of Valois, the brother of the King of France, but his ascent to the throne came with an unprecedented condition. Before he could be crowned, he was forced to sign and swear to uphold the Henrician Articles. This was not a request, it was a non-negotiable contract for employment as the Polish-Lithuanian monarch. The terms of this contract were breathtaking in their scope and their limitation of royal power. The Articles effectively made the king not a sovereign ruler, but a chief executive officer employed by the noble nation. First and foremost, they formalized the practice of electio viritum, meaning the king would henceforth be elected by the entire body of the nobility, not born into the role. This alone was a stunning blow to the principle of dynastic monarchy, but the restrictions went much deeper. The king was forbidden from declaring war or raising taxes without the explicit consent of the Sejm, the parliament of the nobility. He could not appoint his own heirs or determine the succession. That right belonged solely to the noble electorate. Perhaps most remarkably, the Articles embedded the legal right of rebellion directly into the Constitution. The Rokos was a formal, legal mechanism through which the nobility could renounce their allegiance to a king who violated their laws and liberties. In essence, the document gave the nobles the lawful authority to fire their monarch for underperformance. To ensure no future king could ever claim ignorance or later revoke these terms, the Articles were required to be sworn to by every single monarch at their coronation, making them a permanent and inviolable fixture of the Commonwealth's political landscape. The Golden Liberty, as enshrined in these documents, created a political culture unlike any other. It fostered a powerful sense of collective identity and civic responsibility among the Szlachta, who saw themselves not as subjects but as stakeholders in the Republic. The system was designed to prioritize consensus and negotiation over autocratic decree. In the Sejm, the principle of liberum veto, where any single delegate could nullify all the legislation passed by a session, was the ultimate expression of this belief in unanimous consent. In theory, it protected the rights of the minority against the tyranny of the majority. This intricate system of checks and balances prevented the kind of bloody internal civil wars over royal succession that plagued other European kingdoms. For over a century, it provided remarkable internal stability and allowed for a flourishing of religious tolerance and intellectual life within the Commonwealth's borders, making it a refuge for dissenters and thinkers persecuted elsewhere. Yet the very strengths of the Golden Liberty contained the seeds of its eventual downfall. The system's insistence on unanimous consent often led to political paralysis. A single corruptible noble could, and often did, halt all government business by exercising his liberum veto, sometimes bribed by foreign powers eager to keep the Commonwealth weak and unable to respond to external threats. The power of the king was so diluted that it became impossible to enact the swift, decisive reforms needed to maintain a modern standing army or a centralized tax system. As its neighbors Prussia, Russia, and Austria evolved into centralized, militaristic absolutist states, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth remained a noble-led republic, a beautiful but archaic political engine unable to gear up for the wars of the 18th century. Its eventual partitions and erasure from the map were a direct result of this internal political weakness, but to view the Golden Liberty solely through the lens of its ultimate failure is to miss its profound and lasting significance. It stands as the most radical experiment in noble-led democracy and constitutional monarchy the early modern world ever produced. It was a bold attempt to build a state founded on law, contract, and consensus rather than on the whims of a single ruler. Its principles of elective government, legal resistance to tyranny, and the separation of powers would echo through the ages, influencing the framers of modern democracies. The Henrician Articles were not just a script, they were a blueprint for an entirely different way of imagining power, one where the written word of a constitution could truly bind a king and empower a citizenry, proving that the most revolutionary ideas often begin not with a declaration of independence, but with a carefully negotiated job description. And so we arrive at a document that, on its surface, seems to be about launching one of the most violent and tumultuous periods in medieval history, yet hidden within its text is a quieter, more profound ambition to end violence altogether. When Pope Urban II stood before a council of bishops and nobles in Clermont, France, in 1095, his primary goal was not simply to rally knights for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem. That call to arms, which would indeed ignite the First Crusade, was the dramatic finale of a much broader and more nuanced agenda. The official decrees produced by the Council of Clermont were a comprehensive package of reform, and a significant portion of them was dedicated to a radical and ongoing peace movement within Europe itself, the peace and truce of God. For decades, the Church had been struggling to contain the endemic, petty warfare that ravaged the European countryside. This was not war between kings, but a constant, low-level conflict between local lords and their knights, feuds over land, honor, and inheritance that were fought at the expense of the peasantry, the clergy, and the stability of entire regions. Monasteries were looted, farms were burned, and non-combatants were routinely caught in the crossfire. The Church's response was not to raise an army, but to promulgate a revolutionary idea that there were certain times, certain places, and certain people who should be immune from violence. The peace of God declared that clergy, pilgrims, merchants, and peasants, along with their tools, animals, and lands, were off limits. The truce of God took this even further, prohibiting any fighting from Wednesday evening until Monday morning each week, and extending this sacred truce to encompass all of Advent, Lent, and major religious feasts. This was an attempt to effectively quarantine violence, to limit it to a few specific days, and to protect the economic and spiritual life of the community. What Pope Urban II did at Clermont was to take this localized, often inconsistently enforced movement and supercharge it with the full, universal authority of the papacy. He didn't just endorse the concept, he codified it into canon law within the council's decrees. This transformed the peace and truce from a set of pious suggestions into a binding religious obligation for all Christians, enforceable by the threat of excommunication. This was a breathtaking use of textual authority to regulate the behavior of the warrior aristocracy. The Church, which lacked a standing army, was using its power over the human soul, the fear of eternal damnation, as its enforcement mechanism. The decree cleverly channeled the martial energy of the knightly class, offering them a stark choice. You can continue your destructive feuding at home and face spiritual ruin, or you can redirect your violence toward a sanctioned, holy cause in the East and earn spiritual reward. It was a masterful piece of psychological and political maneuvering. The call to crusade was not just an addition to the peace decrees, it was their logical extension, a pressure valve designed to siphon off the very violence the Church was trying to suppress within Christendom. The long-term impact of this aspect of the Clermont decrees is often overshadowed by the epic drama of the Crusades, but it is deeply significant. By lending the full weight of papal authority to the peace and truce of God, Urban was making a powerful statement that the Church had the right and the responsibility to legislate peace, even between secular rulers. It established a precedent that would be used for centuries, where popes and councils would act as international arbiters, using the threat of spiritual penalties to negotiate truces and settle disputes between warring monarchs. This script helped to slowly, incrementally, build a concept of a regulated, just war and a responsibility to protect the innocent. It planted the idea that there were moral and legal limits to warfare, that might did not always make right, and that even the most powerful noble was subject to a higher law, a law that was written down, proclaimed, and enforced by the authority of the written word. The Council of Clermont Decrees, therefore, represent a fascinating duality, a document that is famous for launching a war, but which was equally intended to curtail one, proving that a single text could wield two very different kinds of power. While the Golden Liberty sought to manage power through consensus within a commonwealth, an entirely different kind of script was being crafted to manage an explosion of power on a global scale, a document that would attempt to impose order on the chaotic and breathtakingly vast unknown. The year is 1493, and the world has just been turned inside out. Christopher Columbus's return from his first voyage has sent seismic shocks through the courts of Europe. He hasn't reached Asia as intended, but he has stumbled upon something arguably more consequential, a whole new world teeming with potential wealth and souls to be converted. But this discovery immediately triggers a diplomatic crisis between the two great naval powers of the age, Spain and Portugal. Portugal, under King John II, is incensed. For most of the 15th century, Portuguese explorers had been painstakingly mapping the African coast, pushing further and further south in search of a route to the Indies. They had invested decades and fortunes in this endeavor, operating under a series of papal bulls that granted them exclusive rights to conquest and trade in the regions they discovered. In their view, Columbus, an Italian sailing for Spain, had brazenly jumped the queue, sailing west into what they considered their sphere of influence. The situation was a powder keg. Both nations were armed with powerful fleets, both were fueled by a potent mix of religious zeal and greed, and both were prepared to defend their right to these newfound lands, which promised unimaginable riches and imperial glory. It was the Pope, Alexander VI, who stepped in to prevent this clash of emerging superpowers. The papacy, as the spiritual leader of Christendom, had long acted as an arbiter in disputes between Catholic monarchs, and this was arguably the most momentous arbitration in history. In 1493, Alexander issued a series of bulls, the most important being in Turquetera, which drew an imaginary line from north to south 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the west of this line, the Pope declared, was granted to Spain for exploration and conquest. Everything to the east, including the route around Africa to the true Indies, remained the domain of Portugal. On the surface, this was a neat and divinely sanctioned solution, but the Portuguese were not satisfied. King John II, a shrewd and practical ruler known as the Perfect Prince, argued that the line was too close to his territory and would hinder Portuguese navigation in the Atlantic. He opened direct negotiations with Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, threatening to send his own fleet west to enforce his claims. the stage was set for a tense diplomatic standoff, one that could easily spiral into open naval warfare in the middle of the ocean. The remarkable thing is what happened next. Instead of letting their ships decide the matter, the two monarchs chose to send their best diplomats and cosmographers to the Spanish town of Tordesillas. There, in 1494, they negotiated a new treaty that would move the Papal line. The Treaty of Tordesillas shifted the demarcation line to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. This was not a random decision. It was a calculated move based on the best, though still deeply flawed, geographical knowledge of the time. The Portuguese negotiators, it is widely believed, had a secret motive. They may have already had hints of a large landmass bulging into the Atlantic to the east of this new line, the coast of Brazil. The new terms gave Portugal a much larger slice of the Atlantic, and as it turned out, just enough of a foothold in South America to claim what would become the largest country on the continent. The Spanish, focused on the riches they believed Columbus had found in the Caribbean, agreed. The treaty was then sent back to Pope Julius II for confirmation in 1506, making its terms a matter of both international law and holy decree. The sheer audacity of this document is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. Two monarchs in a European town, with a few strokes of a pen and the guidance of a map that was mostly blank space, divided the entire undiscovered world between them. They were drawing borders across continents and oceans they couldn't even imagine, allocating the futures of millions of people and millions of square miles of territory without any knowledge of what was actually there. This was the ultimate expression of the power of a script, the belief that reality itself could be dictated by the clauses of a treaty. The Treaty of Tordesillas successfully achieved its primary goal. It prevented an immediate war between Spain and Portugal. It provided a legal framework that allowed both empires to expand for over a century without direct conflict over territorial claims, channeling their aggressive energies outward against indigenous peoples rather than against each other. It set a crucial precedent for international law, the idea that newly discovered territories could be allocated through diplomatic negotiation and recognized by the broader community of nations. But the treaty's legacy is a complex and often dark one. Its most immediate effect was to exclude all other European powers from the scramble for new worlds. England, France, and the Netherlands, who were not party to the agreement, simply refused to recognize its authority. The French King Francis I would later joke that he would like to see the clause in Adam's will that divided the world between Spain and Portugal. This dismissal led to the rise of piracy, privateering, and eventually open challenges to the Iberian monopoly, as other nations carved out their own empires in defiance of the Papal line. Furthermore, the treaty's division was based on a fundamental geographical error, the underestimation of the Earth's size, and the complete ignorance of the Pacific Ocean. When the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan, now sailing for Spain, found a western route to the Spice Islands in 1521, he triggered a new crisis. Both Spain and Portugal claimed the Moluccas were on their side of the Tordesillas line. This led to the need for yet another treaty, the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529, which drew a second antipodal line through the Pacific, demonstrating the absurd difficulty of applying a two-dimensional solution to a spherical planet. Ultimately, the Treaty of Tordesillas stands as a monumental testament to both the power and the arrogance of the written word. It shows how a document, born from diplomacy and a desire to avoid conflict, could be used to assert a claim of ownership over the entire globe, shaping the demographics, languages, and cultures of the Americas for centuries to come. It proved that a script could not only prevent a battle, but could also lay the foundation for empires upon which the sun would never set. But sometimes the most powerful legal scripts are not those that are newly written. but those that are rediscovered and repurposed for a completely different age. Imagine a dusty, ancient legal code written for a long-vanished tribe of warrior people, sitting forgotten in a monastic library for centuries. Then, suddenly, it is unearthed and presented not as a historical curiosity, but as the foundational law of the most powerful kingdom in Europe. This is the extraordinary story of the Salic Law, originally compiled by the Frankish King Clovis in the early 6th century. It was a detailed legal guide for the Salian Franks, covering everything from wergild payments for injuries to inheritance customs. One of its many clauses stated that, concerning Salic land, no portion of the inheritance shall go to a woman, but the whole inheritance of the land shall come to the male sex. In its original context, this was a practical rule for a tribal society, likely meant to keep land the source of military power within the hands of men who could bear arms and fight. For hundreds of years after the Frankish Empire evolved into France, this clause was largely irrelevant, a forgotten footnote in a long-abandoned legal system. The Capetian kings who ruled France had frequently passed the crown to their sons without issue, and the law of the land was a messy patchwork of feudal custom, not the ancient Salic code. This all changed in the 1300s when the direct line of the Capetian dynasty faced a catastrophic crisis. King Charles IV died in 1328 without a male heir. This created a terrifying power vacuum. The two most powerful claimants to the throne were his nephew, King Edward III of England, who was the son of Charles's sister, and a French cousin, Philip of Valois, who was the son of Charles's uncle. The French nobility faced an impossible choice: accept a foreign king from a rival nation, which was utterly unpalatable, or find a legal justification to bypass the English claim entirely. It was in this moment of high-stakes political emergency that the old Salic Law was dramatically resurrected. Royal lawyers and propagandists, scouring history for any precedent to support Philip's claim, seized upon that single, obscure clause about land inheritance. With breathtaking audacity, they argued that this ancient rule governing private property should also apply to the most public property of all, the Crown of France itself. They creatively reinterpreted the text, arguing that the Salic land in question was not just any field, but the entire kingdom. Therefore, they declared, no woman could inherit the French throne, and crucially, this disability extended through the female line. This meant that not only could a daughter not become queen, but her son, like Edward III, could have no claim whatsoever. This was a legal fabrication of the highest order, but it was a brilliantly effective one. It provided the perfect, seemingly ancient, and unimpeachably French justification for crowning Philip VI as the first Valois king, and for utterly rejecting Edward III's claim. When Edward later pressed his claim by force, initiating the 100 Years' War, the French response was not just military, it was deeply ideological. They weaponized the Salic Law, turning it into a cornerstone of French national identity. It was no longer just a legal argument, it was a sacred principle that defined the French state as unique and separate from England. Propagandists wrote tracts and poems celebrating the Salic Law as the eternal, divine law that protected France from the chaos of foreign rule. It became a rallying cry, a reason to fight that was more powerful than mere loyalty to a king. The law's genius was that it provided clarity and certainty in an area royal succession that was often murky and driven by force. By creating an absolute, written rule that excluded the entire female line, it removed countless potential claimants from the picture before they could even become a problem. It prevented the kind of destructive dynastic squabbles that plagued other monarchies, where every noble with a drop of royal blood from a grandmother or an aunt might raise an army to press a dubious claim. In France, the rule was simple, clear, and left no room for debate. The crown passed through the male line only. The long-term impact of this medieval repurposing of an ancient text cannot be overstated. For over 4 centuries, the Salic Law provided a stable, predictable framework for succession in France, arguably contributing to the internal stability that allowed the French monarchy to gradually centralize its power and become the epitome of absolutism. It wasn't just a legal technicality, it was a foundational myth of the French state, so deeply ingrained that it was never seriously challenged until the French Revolution. The law's influence even spread beyond France, adopted in various forms by other European kingdoms seeking to avoid their own succession crises. The story of the Salic Law is the ultimate example of how a text, even an ancient and largely forgotten one, can be rediscovered and reinvented to serve a pressing political need. It shows that the authority of a script often lies not in its original intent, but in its perceived antiquity and its usefulness in the present moment. The French lawyers who exhumed this clause weren't historians. They were political strategists using the written word as their most potent weapon to avert a civil war, redefine a nation's identity, and change the course of European history for generations to come. After more than a century of sporadic but brutal conflict, the 100 Years' War had become a grinding, exhausting reality for both England and France. By the final quarter of the 15th century, the romantic ideals of chivalry that had launched the struggle had long since faded, replaced by the grim calculus of financial exhaustion and the pragmatic needs of state building. In England, King Edward IV found himself ruling a kingdom still deeply fractured by the internal convulsions of the Wars of the Roses. His claim to the throne was secure for the moment, but it was a fragile peace, constantly threatened by Lancastrian loyalists and restless nobles. He desperately needed money to consolidate his power, reward his supporters, and build a stable administration, not to pour more resources into a seemingly endless war across the Channel. In France, the situation was almost the reverse. King Louis XI, a ruler so cunning and shrewd he was nicknamed the Universal Spider, was meticulously weaving together the final threads of French territorial unity. Through a combination of diplomacy, purchase, and calculated betrayal, he had nearly succeeded in subduing the last of the great semi-independent feudal duchies that had long challenged royal authority. The last thing he needed was a fresh English invasion to disrupt his carefully laid plans and force him to fight a costly war on 2 fronts. Both monarchs were, in their own ways, masters of realpolitik. They saw the war not as a glorious destiny, but as an expensive problem. And for master problem solvers, the solution was not a final, decisive battle, but a brilliantly crafted piece of paper. The stage was set in the summer of 1475. Edward IV, pressured by his brother, the Duke of Clarence, and other nobles who still dreamed of martial glory and plunder, finally assembled a large and well-equipped army. He crossed the Channel and landed in Calais, preparing to march into France and reignite the old conflict. Louis XI, ever the Spider, did not rush to meet him with a massive force. Instead, he began to spin his webs. He opened secret back-channel communications with Edward's key advisors. He knew Edward's real weakness was not a lack of soldiers, but a lack of funds. Louis's strategy was not to win a war, but to purchase a peace. The 2 kings agreed to meet on a bridge over the Somme River near the town of Picquigny. The scene itself was a masterpiece of theatrical diplomacy designed to ensure security and symbolize parity. A special wooden barrier was constructed in the middle of the bridge, with a latticework strong enough to prevent assassination attempts, but open enough to allow the monarchs to see each other and converse. There, on the 29th of August, they negotiated the terms that would finally, officially, end the war that had defined their nations for 116 years. The Treaty of Picquigny was a monument to pragmatism, a document that exchanged glory for gold. Its core was a simple financial transaction. King Louis agreed to pay King Edward an immediate cash indemnity of 75,000 gold crowns. Furthermore, he promised to pay an annual pension of 50,000 crowns to the English crown for the rest of Edward's life. In return, Edward agreed to withdraw his army from French soil and to abandon his claim to the French throne for the duration of Louis's life. The treaty was then fortified with a marriage alliance, pledging Edward's daughter, Elizabeth of York, to Louis's son and heir, the Dauphin Charles, a union that, while it never ultimately took place, added a layer of familial obligation to the cold, hard cash. To ensure compliance, the treaty included detailed clauses for hostages and guarantees. This was not a document based on trust. It was a contract built on mutually assured financial benefit and carefully balanced security arrangements. The immediate reaction from the English camp was one of stunned disappointment. Many of Edward's nobles and knights, who had invested their own money in the campaign expecting rich plunder and ransoms, felt cheated of their chance for glory and profit. They derisively called the pensions paid to Edward and his ministers tribute money, but Edward knew better. He had achieved everything a successful campaign might have gained: a massive infusion of cash and a secure southern flank, without risking a single battle or the life of a single soldier. He returned to England wealthier and more secure than when he had left, his royal coffers filled not with the spoils of war, but with the fruits of a superb negotiation. The long-term significance of the Treaty of Picquigny extends far beyond its immediate financial terms. It represents a fundamental shift in the nature of European statecraft, a move away from the feudal and chivalric notions of honor and glory, and toward a modern, pragmatic understanding of national interest. It demonstrated that war could be concluded not by the unconditional surrender of one side, but through a mutually beneficial business arrangement. For France, Louis secured a permanent end to the English threat on the continent, allowing him to complete his life's work of unification without further distraction. The money he paid out was a fraction of what a single year of full-scale warfare would have cost his treasury. For England, Edward gained the financial stability he needed to strengthen his monarchy and begin the process of rebuilding after the civil wars, setting the stage for the Tudor consolidation that would follow. Perhaps most importantly, the treaty established a powerful precedent. It showed future rulers that diplomacy and finance could be more effective tools than armies for securing a nation's interests. The Treaty of Picquigny did not just end a war. It helped usher in a new era of international relations, where the most powerful weapon in a monarch's arsenal could be a well-negotiated contract and a promise to keep the peace. From forged decrees to painstaking treaties, these 20 secret scripts prove that the pen was indeed mightier than the sword in medieval rulership. They redirected empires, prevented wars, and forged alliances through the subtle power of written words, showcasing how diplomacy and documentation could achieve what armies could not. Each of these documents, from the audacious forgery of the donation of Constantine to the pragmatic financial settlement of the Treaty of Picquigny, reveals a timeless truth. The most durable power is often constructed not through force, but through persuasion, negotiation, and the enduring authority of the written record. These rulers and their advisors understood that a carefully crafted clause could secure a kingdom, a well-placed signature could prevent a civil war, and a single piece of parchment could outlast the mightiest fortress. As we reflect on these profound historical lessons, it becomes clear that our modern world of governance still operates on these very same principles. The intricate trade agreements between nations, the complex treaties that define international borders, and even the constitutions that protect our rights, all are direct descendants of the medieval scripts we've explored. The quiet engines of history, those scribes and diplomats working in candlelit chambers, have their counterparts today in lawmakers, negotiators, and clerks who continue to shape our world from behind desks rather than on battlefields. The challenges may be different, but the tools of statecraft remain remarkably familiar. The power of a promise, the weight of a signature, and the authority of a document that carries the force of law. If you found this journey into the quiet corners of power fascinating, we'd love to hear which of these secret scripts surprised you the most. Was it the sheer audacity of the donation of Constantine, or the pragmatic genius of the Treaty of Windsor that's still in force after centuries? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get a conversation started about the unsung documents that shaped our world. And if you're eager for more deep dives into the hidden mechanisms of history, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Remember, sometimes the most profound changes, the ones that truly alter the course of human events, begin not with the clamor of battle, but with the deliberate scratch of a quill on parchment at the